Right then, hello, this is social influence. In particular, this is looking at conformity, and we're looking at types of conformity in this particular video. And it's important you remember that term because it's quite common that people get muddled up between what types of conformity are and what explanations of conformity are. So make sure that you've put somewhere on your notes in nice big letters types of conformity for what we've got here today. Right, so there are three types of conformity. The first type is compliance. This is publicly conforming to the behaviour or views of others in a group, but privately maintaining your own views. So this is exactly what we saw in Ash's experiment, where you're changing your views because of public pressure. So you're saying something that you don't really agree with just to fit in temporarily. That's the idea of compliance. You're maintaining your own viewpoint inside, you're just conforming publicly to avoid ridicule. So compliance. Then what we have is identification is our second type, which is where you adopt the views or behaviour of a group both publicly and privately because of you value membership of that group. So for example, your group of friends, if they hold a certain view or are doing a certain behaviour, then you might adopt those, but it would often only be like a temporary change. So for example, someone who goes to university and they live in a house in which all their housemates are vegan, and while they're at university they're quite happy to adopt that. They value being in the house, they get on well with their friends and kind of see their point of view, so they might buy vegan food and only cook vegan food while they're at university, but when they go home for the holidays they might just go back to eating meat and other dairy products and so on. So that's identification. It's all about the fitting with a particular group because you value the membership, but it's still temporary. So it's a deeper form of conformity than compliance, which is where in compliance you're maintaining your own view in private and not actually agreeing with it. So in identification you might agree with it, but it's still only temporary. So the last type of conformity is internalization, public and private change that is permanent and long-lasting. So when you're, let's give one example of that. For example, if someone converts religion, so if you've got someone who is an atheist, and they get chatting to a friend who's Christian or Muslim, and then decide that actually they agree with what's being said to them, and they adopt that faith, and they if they became a Christian they'd get baptized or something. It's a permanent change, or a long-lasting change, that's not just temporary. It's in public and in private. So when you're describing these three things, you need to think about talking about two things. First of all, is the change public or private, or both, or neither? Secondly, is the change temporary or permanent? So if you're outlining any of these in an exam question, try and talk about both those things because it makes your answer better. It's quite common for people to give waffly answers. Also, learn three really good examples that you can put with each of these, because if that's all of your outline, then you're going to need more, aren't you, to pad it out if you have 6 marks to fill. Right, evaluation. So let's talk about what research support there is for each of those different types of conformity. And the first thing we're going to do is talk about a study by Jennis, which is quite a well-known, quite a cool experiment. Basically, he had a glass bottle filled with jelly beans, and what he was trying to do is see what happens particularly with conformity when you ask someone to estimate the number of jelly beans in a jar. So what he did was this. He got people to estimate individually, then in a group, and then individually again, and he wants to see if their opinion changes. Now, normally I actually model this out with members of the class to just make it clear how it worked, but obviously I haven't got you guys right now to do that with, so I've done it with the people that I have available, which are my kids. So this is how it worked. I recreated this experiment earlier for you. So, how many beans do you think are in the jar? My son says 11, which you can see is quite a long way off, but he's only 3. And then we've got my daughter, she said 999 beans are in this jar. So that's their individual estimates. What happens next is the participants were put in a group to discuss it. So when I did that with my 2, this is what happened. He said 11. She said, no, it's definitely more than that. And then he said, okay, 100. Right, then I asked them each individually, which is what Janice did again after this. They're asked individually, how many beans do you think are in the jar now? And you got one of 2 responses to that. Either stay the same or change your estimate. And you can see my son's changed his estimate to 100 from 11, but my daughter's sticking with 999. So that's not quite the finding from the original experiment, but that shows you kind of how it worked, hopefully, in the original experiment. So actually, in the original, almost everyone changed their estimate. And if you look online, you can see the results tables. It's quite a well-known experiment, quite easy to find. They've lined them up for men and women and so on, and you can see that most people changed their estimate, I think, by about 200 or 300 beans in the end. Very few didn't change at all. So what Jennison concluded was that this was quite a good example of internalisation, because what people were doing, they were changing their estimate to fit the group. And if they had just changed their estimate in the group and then reverted back when they were in private, that would show that all that was happening was compliance. They were just saying something to not stand out, but actually maintaining their own private view. But actually, because they're sticking to that new estimate when they're back in private with no witnesses, they're maintaining that view in private as well as in public. It's been a permanent change. So that's a really good example of internalisation. It's public and private, and it's permanent. So this is research support, this study, for the idea of internalisation. Okay, so that's our first study that we look at. And the other study, actually, that you can use for this particular type of conformity, internalisation, is ASH. And in the task difficulty variation of Ash's study, again, he found that people were conforming more when it was difficult. So they were looking to other people for answers and adopting their answers because they thought that was the right answer, because they weren't sure. So again, you can use Ash's task difficulty variation because they're adopting it publicly and privately because they don't know, and it's permanent as well. So that's the second study that supports the idea of internalisation. Then we've got, in terms of identification, we've got Zimbardo's experiment, which you've probably heard of, but we've not done in detail yet. We'll do it in detail soon, so I'm not going to go into it in any detail particularly now. But this is the prison study, Stanford prison study, and what they actually did was they got people to be, some people were prisoners and some people were guards. These were all participants, and they wanted to see how much they would conform to the role that they were put into. So it's slightly different. It's how much do we conform to a social role. It's not conforming in terms of information or a decision. It's a little bit different, but the really interesting thing was that they found that both groups really did conform to the roles that they were put into. So that's quite a nice example of identification, because they're identifying with the group that they're put into. They're making a public and a private change for the length of the experiment, so the guards are acting brutally and doing all these things that kind of fit with the behaviour of the guard, but when they come away from the experiment, they're like, whoa, why did I do that? You know, that I really surprised myself. And you'll see when we do it that some of them made comments that were really like that. So identification, that's our research support for it, is Zimbardo's prison study. They identified with the role and they conformed to it. Although when we do Zimbardo, you'll see it perhaps wasn't quite that straightforward, and we'll look at a few exceptions. Right, the third study we're going to look at again is, well, compliance. For the type of conformity, compliance, we use Ash's original study to support it. That is because what you've got is, in Ash's original study, it's an obvious answer. They're giving an obvious wrong answer just to fit in. In private, they know it's the wrong answer, but they're just giving it in public. So that is why we use Ash's original study to support the idea of compliance. So in your notes, what you need to do is make sure that you can explain why each of these studies supports each of these types of conformity. I would suggest that you draw up some kind of table like this with the name of study, kind of conformity it supports, and why it supports that kind of conformity. And remember to use those words. Is it public? Is it private? Is it temporary? Is it permanent? Okay.